Continuing our exploration of the book of Genesis and the idea of origins and beginnings, in this session we're going to be looking particularly at Genesis chapters 6 through 9, which lay a foundation for understanding human history and development. These chapters are particularly helpful when we look at the catastrophe called the flood and understand that this is a key event that can explain for us many geological phenomena that we find in the world today. Genesis 6 through 9 then describe for us one of the most catastrophic events in the Bible, the flood of Noah. The only other event which is more destructive and far-reaching in its consequences recorded in the scriptures is the fall of Adam. As we have already established, our premise for all study is that the Bible is truth. It's the inspired and inerrant Word of God. It then becomes the foundation for our understanding all other evidences in the natural world. Among other things, the Great Flood is our framework to understand geology. Too often people seek to reconcile the biblical record with changing trends and discoveries in our so-called scientific world. The very fact that these theories and discoveries are constantly changing and being updated should indicate their nature. Science is, in reality, the process of discovering how God does things. His history is true history, and all scientific discoveries will ultimately always point to the veracity of the biblical record. We begin then by emphasizing that these chapters that we're looking at are genuine and trustworthy accounts of actual historical events. They're not just myths or traditions. Too often, creation has been relegated to a series of Bible stories in church or the religious education class at school, while naturalistic explanations for the universe are constantly exalted to the high place of fact through the science and history classes. A key to reclaiming our culture is to provide an educated framework through which our people can see the fallacies involved in evolutionary models and the abundant proof that a creation model is not only viable, but also probable. In this session, we will consider the following: Noah, the man himself and his surroundings, the identity of the sons of God in Genesis 6, the ark, the global flood, the fossil record, the result of the global flood, and dinosaurs. We do not presume to present expert information, but rather layman's arguments for the creation model as outlined in Genesis 1 through 11. The student is directed to ministries such as Answers in Genesis and Creation Ministries for a more detailed analysis of the subject by experts in many scientific disciplines. The aim of these sessions is to provide the student with basic understandings and to challenge accepted models which contradict the biblical record of events. So looking at Noah, we find that Noah was a man who found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Herbert Lockyer wrote an excellent book called All the Men of the Bible, and in that he looks at the person of Noah. Now, Noah's name means rest. He was the son of Lamech, of the posterity of Seth, the 10th from Adam. He died at age 950 years. The Septuagint version says that the name is a play on the statement, "This same shall give us rest." He was the man who built the ark. Nothing is known of the early life of Noah, who first appeared on the scene first appears in the Bible when he's 500 years old. Evidently, his father, Lamech, was a religious man and gave his son a fitting name meaning rest. This much we do know about Noah. He lived in a time when men were universally corrupt, so much so that God said he would destroy the human race. In the midst of an age of moral darkness, Noah was perfect in his generation. He walked with God and had a life radiant with righteousness. Intimate with God, he learned of God's purpose to destroy mankind and was given the strange and almost impossible task of building a vessel large enough to shelter his family and a pair of all the birds and beasts of that time. Noah was about the tremendous work of the ark's construction. He set about building this great boat. Daily he had to endure the ridicule of the godless, and at last the waters of judgment covered the earth, but all within the ark were safe and saved. What a striking illustration the ark affords of Christ, who preserves us from the flood of divine judgment. Lockyer also pulls out the following points regarding Noah's life. He walked with God in spite of surrounding iniquity. He was obedient when appointed a difficult task. He was remembered by God and delivered from death. Noah, by faith, worked out his salvation. Noah warned his neighbors of impending judgment. He built the first recorded altar in the scriptures in Genesis 8, verse 20. And Noah was honored by God with an everlasting covenant, Genesis 9, 12 to 17. So what were these events that precipitated the judgment that we call the flood? You can read about them in Genesis 6, verse 1 to 8. It says, "It came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, that daughters were born to them. And the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. By this 10th generation of earth, God looked upon the consequences of sin and grieved in his heart. Every imagination of men's hearts were toward evil and inspired by the enemy. Only Noah found grace in God's eyes. And it's worth noting that from the very beginning, salvation has always been by grace. This onslaught of evil was in part inspired by some strange events which the Holy Spirit chose to record for our instruction. And these events are recalled in verses 2 and 4 of Genesis 6. Much debate surrounds the meaning of these verses, and particularly the identity of what are called the sons of God. There are two main views concerning this matter, and we're going to summarize them as they're presented in Wilmington's Guide to the Bible. Number one, the sons of God are simply the sons of Seth. This is the simple interpretation that the sons of God were those individuals belonging to the line of Seth, while the daughters of men were the unsaved girls who belonged to the line of Cain. Basic arguments for this view are, number one, this is the most natural way to interpret the passage. Number two, it's supported by Jesus' statement in Matthew 22, verse 30. And just take a look at that and see what you think. Number three, because of the law of biogenesis, life begetting similar life, the idea that this could be some kind of extraterrestrial life, that the sons of God, is against that law. Number four, Paul's statement in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 38 to 40, where he says there are celestial bodies and also terrestrial bodies, indicating that the two can never co-join. Number five, Moses did not use the regular Hebrew word for angel, which is malak, which he later employs at least 28 times in the Pentateuch. And number six, mighty men, the supposed offspring of angels and women, as we'll look at in the next viewpoint, is the Hebrew word gibor, which is used dozens of times in the Old Testament, and always outside of these references refers to human men. The second viewpoint is a more involved interpretation and holds that the sons of God were wicked and fallen angelic beings of some kind who committed immoral and unnatural physical acts with women in general. Basic arguments for this second view are as follows. The Hebrew language seems to favor it. The Hebrew phrase, Bnei Elohim, the sons of God, always refers to angels in the Old Testament. Job 1:6, Job 2:1, 38:7, and Daniel 3:25 all use that same term, referring directly to angels. The Hebrew word Nephilim, translated giants in Genesis 6 verse 4, actually should be rendered the fallen ones. The normal word for a huge man is Rapha. Thus, men like Og and Goliath were described by the word Rapha, not by this word Nephilim, or fallen ones. Number 2, there is almost always a basis for commonly held legends, however weird and distorted they might have become. In 6:4, we read concerning the men of renown, which some believe is the historical basis for the legends of Hercules and other children of the gods type mythologies. This later corresponds to such Babylonian figures as Gilgamesh, the supposed son of a goddess and a mortal. He was called 2/3 God and 1/3 man. The natural coupling of godly men with ungodly women would not produce unusual offspring, as is clearly inferred in these scriptures. Something unnatural is suggested in the text. Fossils have also been found of giant humans in various parts of the world, confirming certainly that giant humans have at times walked the earth. Number 3, the common opinion of Jewish scholars such as Josephus, the great Jewish historian, brings this out in his writing. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament and the Bible used by the Jews, also translates Genesis 6:2 as the angels of God. Number 4, the interpretation of the early church. It was not until the 4th century that another view opposed to the angels of God theory was offered. Number 5, various interpretations of some New Testament passages lend support to this view. Examples include 1 Peter 3:18-20, where Peter says, "For Christ also has once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit, by which he also went and preached to the spirits in prison, which sometime were disobedient, when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water." It's thought by some that these spirits here were the sons of God mentioned in Genesis 6. The reason for their iniquity was a satanic attempt to corrupt human flesh and thus prevent the promised incarnation from taking place. But here Peter describes Christ as telling them that their foul plan didn't work. Another suggested passage along this line is Jude chapter 1, verses 5-7. Number 6. That 2 kinds of fallen angels exist, the unchained and those already chained. The unchained now have access to high places and to the bodies of unsaved men. We can look in Ephesians 6:12, Luke 8:27, Mark 1:23, whereas the chained fallen angels are at present already incarcerated. 2 Peter 2:4, Jude 1:5-7. The thought is that these are chained because of their involvement in Genesis chapter 6. Number 7. Even up to the modern day, stories of sexual encounters with spiritual entities are not uncommon. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines 2 disturbing words: incubus, an evil spirit that lies on persons in their sleep, especially one that has sexual intercourse with women while they are sleeping, and succubus, a demon assuming female form to have sexual intercourse with men in their sleep. Many activities in witchcraft involve deviant and unrestrained sexual activities in order to invite demonic spirits. The system of Tantra specifically utilizes the sexual act to attain oneness with God or gods, supposedly. In contrast, Scripture clearly warns the Christian to flee immoral sexual activity and to honor the sanctity of sexual union within the bounds of strong, lifelong spiritual covenant and marriage with one partner. Colossians 3 verse 5, Romans 13 verse 14, and Galatians 5, 16-17, and 2 Timothy 2:22 all speak of this reality of living a life of sexual purity. So we've also find other scriptures that speak of Noah's day. As in the days of Noah, the Bible also warns us that the spiritual and moral state of the world in the days of Christ's second coming will resemble the pre-flood world of Noah. Luke 17:26-27 says, "As in the days of Noah, so it will be also in the days of the Son of Man. They ate, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. And then the flood came and destroyed them all." These characteristics, which include an increase in satanic and occultic activity, violence, wars, and rumors of wars, a prevailing disdain for the truth and widespread acceptance of false doctrines, a preoccupation with the natural things and pleasures of life, an overwhelmingly materialistic worldview, rapid advances in technology and information, deception on a wide and supernatural scale. All of these are present today in our society. Together with other prophetic time frames suggested in the scripture, the evidence points to, as in the days of Noah, being very descriptive of the time in which we now live. The student is really encouraged to prayerfully consider the following scriptures in this regard: Matthew 24 and 25, Luke 17, 20-37, 2 Peter chapter 2 and 3, the book of Jude, Daniel chapter 12, 2 Timothy 3, verses 3-4. Just take some time now to look at those scriptures and note down some of the things that you discover in your notes. These represent just a few of the scriptures which warn the Christian concerning the end times. A prevailing mindset that will deceive many is business as usual. They will be eating and drinking, getting married, doing business, and many will mock. 2 Peter 3, 3 and 4 says this, "Knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? Swiftly and decisively, however, judgment came in the days of Noah, and it will come in our day." The diagnosis is extensive and detailed. We live in the last days. The prescription for you and I is also clear and strong. Luke 21, 34-36. "Take heed to yourself, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and cares of this life, that day does not come on you unexpectedly. For it will come as a snare on all those who dwell on the face of the whole earth. Watch therefore and pray always, that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things which come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man. Watch therefore and pray always," Jesus said. And Peter also in 1 Peter 4 verse 7, "The end of all things is at hand, therefore be serious and watchful in your prayers." The Holy Spirit begs and urges you to take these warnings seriously. It is no longer business as usual. Our generation is uniquely positioned for the greatest clash of darkness and light that the world has ever experienced. Simply calling ourselves Christians is not sufficient to save us from the tide of evil and deception presently being unleashed on the earth. Be watchful, be alert, be prayerful, and be ready. The Ark. Just as God has provided specific instruction for our generation to pass through the waters of judgment and to pass into the new world through Jesus Christ, so a very detailed instruction was given to Noah for the construction of a massive seafaring vessel which would be robust enough to survive the coming tide. Based on the dimensions given in Genesis 6, scale reconstructions of the ark have been made. Contrary to modern play school depictions of an oversized bathtub stuffed with smiling animals, the ark was in fact an enormous barge-like vessel, perfectly designed to survive the roughest of storms. It was approximately 437 feet long and 73 feet wide and 44 feet high. The ark had a total deck of 97,700 square feet and was the largest ship ever built until 1884 AD. The Ark had the carrying capacity of 520 rail boxcars, ample room for the animals, food and provision, and the living quarters. You'll find some illustrations in the notes of reconstructions that have been made of this great vessel. Scale reconstructions, so you can take a look and get some kind of picture of what this vessel may have looked like when it was actually built. So how did all the animals fit in the ark? Taking into account that the ark was to carry representatives of each kind of animal, not every individual species, and its enormous size, there would have been no lack of space for the animals that boarded the ark. Many of the animals would have been juvenile specimens as well, thereby further reducing the space requirements. Feasibility studies have been conducted in this regard in an article by Jonathan Sarfati, and we've included this at the end of the session's notes if you're interested to go and take a look. Students are encouraged to read the article to help them form a reasonable picture of the events that are described in Genesis. The global flood. The Bible makes it clear that the flood was global in proportion. Genesis chapter 7 and 17 to 24 describes the flood that took place, and it says that all the high hills under the whole of heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. All flesh died that moved upon the earth, birds, cattle, beasts, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man. Some liberal commentators seek to convince readers that the flood was localized, but the scriptures clearly deny this. Reasons to reject the idea of just a merely Mesopotamian flood include this. If the flood were local, how could the waters rise 8 meters above the mountains? Genesis 7:20. Water will always seek its own level. It couldn't rise to cover the local mountains while leaving the rest of the world untouched. Number 2, people who did not happen to be living in the vicinity would not be affected by it. They would have escaped God's judgment of sin. If this happened, what did Christ mean when he likened the coming judgment of all men to the judgment of all men in the days of Noah? A partial judgment in Noah's day means a partial judgment to come. Number 3, God would have repeatedly broken his promise never to send a flood again. Number 4, why did Noah have to build an ark? He could have walked to the other side of the mountains and missed the flood. Number 5, why did God send the animals to the ark so they could escape death? There would have been other animals to reproduce of that kind if these particular ones had died. Number 6, why was the ark big enough to hold all kinds of land vertebrate animals that have ever existed? If only Mesopotamian animals were aboard, the ark could have been much smaller. Number 7, why would birds have been sent on board? These could simply have winged across to a nearby mountain range. Secular evidence also lends support to the historical fact of a worldwide flood. Wilmington, in his Guide to the Bible, records some of these evidences. Number 1, flood traditions can be found in the history of every ancient civilization and culture. The early inhabitants of nearly every country of the world have preserved records of a universal flood. Dr. Richard Andre collected 46 flood legends from North and South America, 20 from Asia, 5 from Europe, 7 from Africa, and 10 from South Sea Islands and Australia. Number 2, marine fossils have been found on top of mountains. Scientists of the 19th century were dismayed to find that as high as they climbed, the rocks yielded skeletons of marine animals, ocean fish, and shells of mollusks. Thus, in ancient days, floodwaters streamed over Mount Everest and all other mountains. A whale's skeleton was once found on top of Mount Sanhorn in the Arctic coast, and other similar skeletons a mile high on California's coastal range. Many fossil fish beds also exist all over the world. The Science magazine, January 9, 1959, states that more than 1 billion fish, averaging 6 to 8 inches in length, died on 4 square miles of bay bottom off the California coastline. Now, the truth is that when a fish dies, its body floats to the surface or sinks to the bottom and is devoured rather quickly, actually in a matter of hours, by other fish. However, the fossil fish found in sedimentary rocks is very often preserved with all its bones intact. Entire shoals of fish over large areas numbering billions of specimens are found in a state of agony, but with no marks of a scavenger's attack. Because of the worldwide animal fossil graveyards, Robert Broom, South African paleontologist, estimated 800 billion skeletons of vertebrate animals exist in the Karoo Formation alone. To this can be added the tens of thousands of fossils of all kinds found in the La Brea tar pits of Los Angeles, California. There is evidence of water bodies in present desert areas. There is the universal occurrence of rivers in valleys too large for the present system. There is evidence from the geological column that suggests two things. Number one, that there was a continuous deposition of the stratum layers from beginning to end. There is no erosion between these layers. In fact, in some layers there are actual ripple marks. In other stratums there exists one or more vertical tree trunks with the same tree marking its way up from top to bottom. Number two, the fossils from supposed different ages in the evolutionary theory actually lived at the same time. So the fossil record, what is the fossil record a result of? We believe it's a result of this global catastrophe, the flood. Two main schools of thought exist regarding the geological record that nature presents us with. Catastrophism is the theory that Earth has been affected by sudden, short-lived, violent events that were sometimes worldwide in scope. The dominant paradigm of geology, however, has for many years been uniformitarianism, also sometimes described as gradualism. From around 1850 to 1980, most geologists endorsed uniformitarianism. The present is the key to the past, and gradualism, the idea that geological changes occur slowly over long periods of time, and rejected the idea that cataclysmic events such as earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or floods of vastly greater power than those observed at the present time played any significant role in the formation of the Earth's surface. Instead, they believed that the Earth had been shaped by the long-term actions of forces such as volcanism, earthquakes, erosion, and sedimentation that could still be observed in action today. In part, the geologists' rejection was fostered by their impression that the catastrophists of the 19th century believed that God was directly involved in determining the history of Earth. Catastrophism of the 19th and early 20th centuries was closely tied to religion, and the catastrophic origins were considered miraculous rather than natural events. One of the key differences between catastrophism and uniformitarianism is that to function, uniformitarianism requires the assumption of vast timelines, whereas catastrophism can function with or without assumptions of long timelines. Now, if there were a worldwide flood, what would we find? If there were a worldwide flood, we would find billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. What do we find? When we look at the surface of the earth, when we look at the geology of the world, we find billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. We will not go into specific examples here. Again, much evidence is discussed in the Answers in Genesis or Creation Ministry websites and booklets. The booklet Stones and Bones by Carl Wieland also covers some basic arguments against uniformitarianism. But our purpose here is to defend the Genesis record as the basis for understanding history. See, our worldview affects how we interpret facts. If we ask the question, when we look at rock layers and fossils today, what do we see? Well, the answer is this. We see layers of rock and fossils, nothing more. What we see is not in the past, but in the present. What is important to grasp is that what differs among scientists is their interpretation of the present facts. We cannot go back and see what actually happened. We can only interpret what we find in the present. In this respect, from natural evidence alone, neither the creationist nor the evolutionist can categorically state that a particular view of our past is certain. Our interpretation of the present facts will undoubtedly be influenced by the worldview through which we view the evidence. And when looking at the Grand Canyon, for example, a uniformitarian, for example, will look at the Grand Canyon in the present and see 1 billion years of history where the river has carved out the Great Valley and sediments that have been laid in layers over millennia. Whereas the biblical creationist will look at that very same evidence and see layers of sediment being laid very rapidly by the flood of Noah's day. So what we find is our worldview, some of the assumptions we have concerning origins will really form a framework to understand present evidence. So how long does it take fossils to form? Many have been led to believe that it takes many thousands of years to form a fossil, as sediments are laid down little by little over millions of years. But this supposition is false, and proof of rapid fossilization is very, very common. In your notes, you will find a link to some interesting information about just how fast fossils can be formed, and some evidences of that on the Answers in Genesis website. There's also a couple of amusing illustrations. We have a fossilized hat and even a fossilized lump of ham. There are also examples of rapid burial and petrification in fossilized jellyfish, animals giving birth, and other phenomena. And a deluge of biblical proportions actually provides perfect conditions to explain the burial and petrification of animals and plants, just as we see in the geology of the Earth's crust. And so what about transitionary fossils? Gradualism, coupled with the evolutionary history, should provide us with a fossil history that's replete with transitionary fossils, those which prove the gradual change from one form of creature to another. If evolution were true, we should find literally millions of such fossils. In actual fact, no such fossils exist whatsoever. The total number of undisputable transitionary fossils that have been discovered since Darwin's day until the very moment that we read this stands at a massive 0. Despite this embarrassing truth, evolution is still taught as a fact of science in our schools. The late Dr. Colin Patterson was senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History. He was an evolutionist and a fossil expert. He wrote a significant book on evolution, and when someone asked him why he did not show any pictures of in-between transitional forms in his book, he wrote the following: "I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. You suggest that an artist should be used to visualize such transformations. But where would he get the information from? I could not honestly provide it. And if I were to leave it to artistic license, would that not mislead the reader? You say," he continues, "that I should at least show a photo of the fossil from which each type of organism was derived. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument." Now looking at Professor Gary Parker's book, Creation, The Facts of Life. He's a scientist who believes very passionately, as we do, in the creation model. And he says this: "Knowledgeable people readily agree that both fossils and rock layers can and do form very rapidly. But there's a catch. Fossils and rock layers are not just found one at a time. Rocks chock full of fossils are buried in layers stacked one on top of another, in places about 2 miles or 3 kilometers thick. Not only that, but there's a tendency for fossils to be found together in certain groups, and a tendency for these groups to be found one after the other in a certain sequence called the geologic column. According to evolution, the geologic column lays out the story of evolution chronologically from bottom to top. Maybe science hasn't explained how evolution works yet, they say, but the fact of evolution is plain to see in the record in the rocks. Life started with a few simple forms, originally produced by time, chance, and chemistry, and we can then chart its progress, the net increase in variety and complexity as we move up through the rock layers. Only an ignorant fundamentalist fanatic with his nose in the Bible could fail to see evidence so clear and convincing as the rock-hard geologic column. But actually there are two interpretations of the geologic column. Two interpretations of fossil groups or geologic systems and their sequence, the geological column. According to the uniformitarian model, systems and the geological column represent stages in the slow and gradual evolution of life over eons of time. Or at least that's the way textbooks, television, museums, and magazines usually try and tell the story. But what is someone who believes the Bible going to say? There really are fossils out there. Those fossils really are in sedimentary rock layers, and those layers really are stacked up on top of one another over 1.5 miles or 2 kilometers deep across the Arizona-Utah border, for example. Now, the geologic column is an idea. It's not an actual series of rock layers. Nowhere on Earth do we find the complete sequence. But still, the geologic column does represent a tendency for fossils to be found in groups, and for these groups to be found in a certain vertical order. Cambrian trilobites and Cretaceous dinosaurs usually are not found together. So why aren't trilobite and dinosaur fossils found together? According to evolution, the answer is easy. The Cambrian trilobites died out millions of years before the dinosaurs evolved. But there is another explanation that seems even more natural. After all, even if trilobites and dinosaurs were alive today, they still couldn't be found together. Why? Because they live in different ecological zones. Dinosaurs were land animals, but trilobites were bottom-dwelling sea creatures. According to the catastrophist model, groups of fossils are the remains of plants and animals once living in different ecological zones at the same time, and they were buried in rapid succession. According to creationists, the geological systems represent different ecological zones, the buried remains of plants and animals that once lived together in the same environment. A walk through the Grand Canyon, then, is not like a walk through evolutionary time. Instead, it's like a walk from the bottom of the ocean, across the tidal wave, over the shore, across the lowlands, and into the upland regions. Several lines of evidence seem to favor this ecological view. A history of gradual transition should provide us with a model as shown in the following diagram. And you'll see this diagram in your notes. And what we should find, if the evolutionary hypothesis were true, would be many transitionary fossils developing gradually into more complex life forms. So we find the complex fossils, and then below that we would expect to see many different transitionary fossils leading to that. What we actually witness is the rapid and sudden appearance of complex forms in the geologic column. The Cambrian explosion, as it's called, has generated extensive scientific debate. Darwin saw it as one of the principal objections that could be lodged against his theory of evolution by natural selection, as have modern-day creationists. S.J. Gould said the fossil record has caused Darwin more grief than joy. Nothing distressed him more than the Cambrian explosion, the coincident appearance of almost all complex organic designs. Scientists have also long been puzzled by its abruptness and the apparent lack of obvious predecessors to the Cambrian fauna. What we actually find in the geological record and the fossil record is the sudden appearance of complex life forms in the Cambrian layer with no prior fossil forms in the lower layers. The real issue, however, is not even so much the scientific debate surrounding this arena, but a theological one. The evolutionary hypothesis demands millions of years of death and suffering prior to the arrival of mankind, late in the evolutionary tale. The Bible, however, clearly attributes the entrance of death and suffering in Earth's history as the direct result of Adam's sin. Prior to this event, there was no death, and all was perfect. Romans 5:12 says that through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin. In reality, these two worldviews are entirely irreconcilable. Our history did not begin billions of years ago and then gradually become more complex, more mature, better formed and perfect, as evolution would lead us to believe. The opposite is actually true. We began in a perfect world into which sin entered, after which a gradual decline has been happening. This decline will come to an end when Christ returns and a perfect universe, apart from sin, is restored. The unchanging laws of thermodynamics also attest to this reality and refute the idea that nature itself spontaneously becomes more complex over time. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy can be changed from one form to another, but it cannot be created or destroyed. And the second law of thermodynamics states that when energy is being transformed from one state to another, some of it is turned into heat energy, which cannot be converted back into a useful form. In other words, this universe may be looked upon as a wound-up clock that is slowly running down. This process of disintegration towards disorder is called entropy. The first law of thermodynamics is often called the law of conservation of energy. This law suggests that energy can be transferred from one system to another in many forms. Also, it states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. Thus, the total amount of energy available in the universe is constant. Einstein's famous equation E equals mc squared describes the relationship between energy and matter. In the equation, the energy E is equal to matter m times the square of a constant c. Einstein suggested that energy and matter are interchangeable. His equation also suggests that the quantity of energy and matter in the universe is fixed, i.e., when God completed the creation of the universe, it contained all the energy it would ever contain. The second law of thermodynamics: heat cannot be transferred from a colder to a hotter body. As a result of this fact of thermodynamics, natural processes that involve energy transfer must have one direction, and all natural processes are irreversible. This law also predicts that the entropy or the breakdown of an isolated system always increases over time. Entropy is the measure of the disorder or randomness of energy and matter in a system. Because of the second law of thermodynamics, both energy and matter in the universe are becoming less useful as time goes on. Perfect order in the universe occurred the instant after creation, when energy and matter and all of the forces of the universe were unified. Evolution, as a theory, contradicts these two laws by stating that even without external application of energy or design, systems become more complex. Science shows, however, that living systems break down and become more disordered over time if energy and design is not applied to prevent it. And now finally we're going to take a look at dinosaurs. What about the dinosaurs? One of the most fascinating fossil records left for our interest are the fossils of the terrible lizards or the dinosaurs. What, if anything, does the Bible have to say about these great beasts? Accounts of dinosaurs are found in the scriptures in Job chapter 40, 15 to 24, which describes the awesome behemoth, and in Job 41, where the sea creature Leviathan is described. Dragons are also mentioned in Jeremiah 14:6 and Malachi 1:3. Stories of such creatures exist in almost all cultures. Flying serpents are mentioned in Isaiah 30 verse 6. Are these references speaking of dinosaurs? Bearing in mind a true and accurate biblical history where dinosaurs lived with humans, it is not unlikely. For a fuller investigation on the subject, Ken Ham's book, The Great Dinosaur Mystery Solved, a biblical view of these amazing creatures, is recommended, which is available from Answers in Genesis or Creation Ministries. The following history is presented by Answers in Genesis as a plausible history of the dinosaurs. First, they were formed. God brought the dinosaurs into existence on the sixth day of the very first week in the history of the universe, about 6,000 years ago. On the same day, he made the other animals that make their homes on land, and with Adam and Eve. It was a perfect place in which all living things dined on the plants that God created for them to eat. Then they fell. So the universe was changed when Adam disobeyed and took a bite of the fruit that God had forbidden him to eat. Before that sad event, death wasn't part of God's beautiful creation. But after Adam disobeyed, he and Eve immediately experienced spiritual death and began the process of decay that would eventually lead to physical death. Meanwhile, violence and death entered the physical world as animals fought and killed each other. We then come to the flood. As time went on, things got so bad that God judged the wickedness he saw with the earth, with an earth-covering flood. He brought 2 of every kind of land creature, including dinosaurs, on board Noah's Ark, where they were safe from the storms and waves, volcanoes, and earthquakes. Those air-breathing animals that weren't selected to go on the ark perished in the great flood. Because of all the water and mud and minerals that were mixed up during this time, the conditions were right, causing the bones of many of these animals and also many of the sea and air creatures to turn into fossils that have since been found around the world. The memory of these animals then faded. After the flood, the dinosaurs, people, and the rest of the animals left the ark and began to refill the earth. Some of the animals found it increasingly difficult to survive in the new world. The climate in some places was much colder than before as a result of the ice age that started after the flood finished. Food sources may have been much less. People were now allowed to kill and eat animals, Genesis 9 verse 3, so use them for food, and also to make clothing, weapons, jewelry, etc. And eventually those animals became extinct. As they slowly died out over the years, men began to forget that they ever lived with these huge creatures, and all that was left of the dinosaurs were their bones and stories about them. And then finally they were found in the present day. Over the years, the stories about the colossal beast turned into legends were written down in various places. Of course, since the actual word dinosaur wasn't invented until 1841 by Sir Richard Owen, we wouldn't expect those ancient accounts to mention dinosaurs as such. But the descriptions of the beasts, sometimes called dragons, certainly match the creatures that we now call dinosaurs. In conclusion, we can trust the biblical record of history as reliable, accurate, and trustworthy. Noah's flood provides us with a framework of reference to interpret the facts and evidence of the natural world around us. A reasonable scientific defense and an integrated philosophy is perfectly possible without compromising our fundamental belief in the Bible as the infallible Word of God.